This is Shoshanah Shear of beahappymom.com and my online store, which is found on Creations from Jerusalem. In this video, we're going to be answering two questions that have come into me recently. I'm going to have to see whether we can do it all in one video. It could be that I have to do a series, so bear with me and we'll see to what extent I can answer these questions. The questions are related, and that's why I'm going to pose both questions and then see what we can do to answer them. The first question came from a student who's studying occupational therapy in Canada, and his question was, what motivated me to get into what he called non-traditional occupational therapy? The second question came from somebody who's offering a business development related service. I subscribe to their email newsletter, and the person, after interacting with me, said that they noticed the question was, I offer individual intervention, group intervention, and in addition to that, I have a book, and perhaps I need to decide which of them I'm going to be focusing on, because how can I be offering all of them? So let's answer these questions because they come up quite a lot. I'm sure that I've actually dealt with these particular topics in various videos, but since the questions are posed to me again, perhaps I'll come up with a slightly different response. Let's play along with it and see where the journey takes us. So speaking of journeys, the answer to how I got into what the student regards as non-traditional occupational therapy and how did I get into offering more than one type of service, the answer comes from my own journey. So let's follow a couple of stops along the process. Some people have virtual book tours, and I've tried doing one in the past, and from that I'm going to borrow an idea and let's do some stops along the way. So let's stop off at the first stop being when I was a student and somebody asked me if I had an idea as to what area of occupational therapy I might end up working in, and my response didn't take too long to come about or to respond to my colleague, my fellow student, and I said to her that I had an idea of starting an OT center. I wasn't quite sure exactly what kinds of clients I would work with in the center, what the details would be. I had some ideas, and over all of the years that I've been working, that I've been qualified as an occupational therapist, various experiences, various places that I've worked in, a number of details have changed and altered this idea that I've had. This last year, having COVID that everybody's been dealing with, thank God I haven't personally had COVID, but since there's this pandemic going on in the world, I have been making a number of major changes, also working from home. I've been stopping doing any of my work in person, and that actually has been in keeping with a direction that I've been working towards in any case. And at the moment, I'm therefore looking at all of my online services and seeing to what extent I can be able to maximize everything I'm doing online. The reason for that is partly because of COVID coming to the world, but it's not the only reason. And since I've been already on a journey to look towards what I can be doing online, I decided to focus on my online services and see whether at a later stage I'll bring back any work in person, or whether by the time I've established and I've got to the position that I'm wanting to with these online services, whether I'll want to do the work in person any longer. So that's a question mark. I haven't got the answer to that yet, but follow along with me. We've got to step one. Step one is how I've got to be working with focusing on my various services online and letting go of my work that I was doing in person. Part of that, as I say, is because of COVID. So let's backtrack a little bit more, and we'll go back to the fact that as a second-year student, I had the idea of starting an OT center. As a third-year student, I had another, let's stop at this next bus stop, train stop, whatever the stop is that we're stopping at, the next marker that made a change in my journey. And the next change, the next stop we're going to stop at is when I was a third-year student, and I picked up an infection, a virus, which turned chronic. And by the end of my third year, I was diagnosed with a chronic debilitating condition, which doctors said to me I needed to take off a year from studying to become an occupational therapy if I had any hope of recovering. And they didn't think that it would be possible that I would ever work as an occupational therapist. Well, having to pay off a bank loan, tuition fees, having commitments with a scholarship and a bursary, and certain other commitments that I had, financial commitments, I didn't have too much choice in being able to follow the doctor's instructions and directives. And so I pushed on. And with that, I had the challenge of what could I do to be able to work and be able to help my body to heal, or to function to the best of my ability, as we call from an OT perspective, to function to the best of my ability and be an occupational therapist. Was this possible? At the time, the services available were very, very limited. Chronic fatigue syndrome, or myalgic encephalomyelitis, fell under the neurological conditions. And as a result, that made certain changes in the healthcare system, starting to offer certain other services. But I myself came to a stage where I was starting to apply all of my skills and all of my theory and my background to myself, to see to what extent could I enable myself to function to the optimum, to be able to continue with my training of occupational therapy and not have to give it up completely. Could I be able to earn? Could I still do my center? I still had this dream and this goal that I was working to. So that's step number 2 along my process. Actually, to be completely honest, step number 1 came before I had the idea of doing a center, and that is that my very first dream and goal and passion was to be an artist. And I've used a lot of my creative skills in many, many ways in my services as an occupational therapist. And when I started working as an occupational therapist, the first job that I had in the first year of working, came my first challenges. So let's come to step number 3, which links to step number 1. A, I would say, is my desire to be an artist, and B would be my desire to start a center. So now in my first year of working, I came across 3 or 4, I would say, experiences that triggered or opened the door to my starting to bring in what the student regards as non-traditional occupational therapy. Actually, the truth is that it led to my trailblazing some new areas of occupational therapy. In addition to that, let's take a step back at this stage and have a look at some terms in the theory of occupational therapy. So traditional and non-traditional occupational therapy is one area of terms. The other way of looking at it could be clinical or non-clinical ways of working in occupational therapy. And the third group would be direct or non-direct treatment, or indirect treatment. So let's keep that in mind. If you're familiar with these terms, you can follow on with the progression. If you're not understanding the terms traditional and non-traditional, clinical and non-clinical, and direct and indirect treatment, please let me know, and I'll be happy to do another video to explain it or to answer you in the comments below. Bear with me and let's continue with this journey a little bit. So now we've got to a stage that 3 or 4 experiences in my first year of working as an occupational therapist opened the doors to my adding other aspects to how I work. The first is that my the three areas that I was placed working, the first one was 7/8 of my 8 hours a day. 7/8 was directed to working as an occupational therapist in neurosurgery, and I was working with individual clients in groups. So that perhaps can start to answer that the business person who says, how can it be that you're offering individual services and group intervention? Well, groups and individual services are part of occupational therapy. It's what I've been doing ever since I was a student, and I don't know how to stop offering that service. So if I'm going to be an occupational therapist, even if I'm working in a non-direct, an indirect, a non-traditional, non-clinical way of working individually as well as in groups is part of being an occupational therapist. So that perhaps answers the first question. So in my first year of working, I had 7/8 that I was doing neurosurgery, and I was working in the ICUs, I was working in trauma unit, I was working in the wards, and I was doing outpatient work. In addition to that, 1/8 was working in ophthalmology. And then I was the first occupational therapist assigned to the maternity, and that wasn't assigned a time. So I don't know how that had to fit into the maths of the 7/8 and 1/8 already finishes 8/8, and still I had to be creating a new role in a new area, working as the first occupational therapist in maternity. Well, those experiences opened up a number of doors for me. The first is that maternity was part of the stepping stone to my trailblazing a whole new way of working, and that was with working in the area of women's health, maternal health, working with women during pregnancy, when they come to the maternity wing, working with mothers who have challenging births, who have challenging, where the child that was delivered was not what they were expecting. In other words, they were expecting a healthy baby, and they gave birth to a baby who had either a syndrome or some complication during childbirth, or something else happened. That's just a little bit of a snippet of the whole area of working with women that I started to develop going back to 1990, that I hadn't heard of, and neither had the hospital that I was working in, of other women working in this area. That's why I was the first OT who was assigned to this area. Unfortunately, due to financial cutbacks, that role was stopped at the end of my first year of working in the area of maternity, but I absolutely loved it. And I'll put a link at the end of the video and also in the notes below to a video which I think is on the front page of my website about my starting to work with women in the role of wife and mother. So that's where that first fork in the road started to happen. And to an extent, I would say that that's non-traditional because of the fact that OTs were not working with mothers in maternity before I got into that area of working, before I was placed having to develop the role. So that's perhaps could answer why did I get into, or what motivated me. I don't know that it was necessarily a conscious motivation, but because of the fact that I was placed as the first OT in maternity, I began to develop a role naturally, because I had to come up with what would be the services, what would I say to the nurses, that they could have an idea as to what kinds of patients to refer to me, or to call me in and say, we have a patient in the maternity ward, could you come in and give us assistance? So that's some of how that developed. I wouldn't necessarily say it was the motivation behind it, but it happened naturally. The next thing is that working in neurosurgery, right in the initial months of my doing so, in fact, I would say the first patient that I ever saw on a neurosurgery ward round was a patient who'd already been through a laminectomy, a certain type of back surgery, and was coming in for a second round. They had to do another stage of surgery, There were very sad details that happened with that I'm not going to get into, but the professor in charge of neurosurgery department asked me if I would please train the patient in principles of back protection. And so I went and I looked at the handouts that we had available in the department, and I found 3 possible options of handouts. They weren't terribly clear, and some of the details were missing from. There needed to be a combination of the 3 handouts to be able to give this over to my patient. So I went to my supervisor and I mentioned this information, and my supervisor said, okay, well, here's your first challenge. Your responsibility is going to be to combine these 3 worksheets. Now, this is going back before the internet with opportunities like Pixabay, or before being able to go to services like Creative Fabrica, I think it is, which is a lovely platform that offers the possibility to purchase illustrations. It goes before that. It goes before having a lot of developments that have happened with the computers and with the internet. We didn't have a computer in our occupational therapy department at the time, in my first year of working. And so everything that I would do with the handouts, I had to do by hand. Now, at this stage, having had a chronic illness and studying a 4-year degree, I was very out of touch my drawing skills in life drawing. And so I was a little bit hesitant to draw the illustrations that were required and necessary to put this handout together. And so I began in doing the research necessary for the wording that would have to go into it. And from there, as is mentioned in my book, I came up with developing and researching a different program. So programming became a task that I got into, and I developed a number of programs over my years of being an occupational therapist. As I've mentioned, my first year of working was in 1991, so this is going back quite a few years. Although I didn't manage to complete bringing out that handout because of the delays in doing the illustrations necessary, having been requested to do those illustrations started to open a door, and that was that actually perhaps it was possible for me to combine my love of art with occupational therapy, and perhaps that is a way in which I started to open my mind to other ways of using occupational therapy, to other ways of using my skills. And perhaps subconsciously, I've been searching for various ways to combine my love of art with my training in occupational therapy. So that perhaps answers how I got into non-traditional ways of using OT. I would say that it's not necessarily non-traditional, but perhaps expanding the profession would be a better way of looking at things. Now let's go a little bit further, and in that 1/8 of working in ophthalmology, I was assigned to work with a child who was blind and had developmental delays due to being hospitalized as many times as he was from a different condition, the physical condition that he had. And while I was working with this child, because of financial restraints in the hospital where I was working, I had to create a number of pieces of equipment. So I made a set of dominoes that was tactile for him. The dots, instead of being just dots or pictures, were raised that he could be able to feel them. I also made a mobile that was suitable for somebody who did not have vision but could rather have sound and tactile, that he could reach up and feel this mobile. I made a number of other pieces of equipment as well. And so now let's keep those ideas in mind, that I had a desire to start an OT center. I'd been requested to develop a handout that used writing skills and drawing skills. Plus, I made a number of pieces of equipment. I got into some program development, and I was assigned a position to be able to start a new role of being the first OT in maternity. With all of that and that experience, keep in mind that this is quite demanding. It's physically taxing, it's exciting, it's challenging, and yet I had at the time a chronic illness which meant that I had low energy. So while I was searching with how to combine all of my skills and ideas towards being able to develop the center that I wanted to develop, I was also on the lookout for how to either heal myself physically, since the doctors had nothing much that they could offer, and there wasn't yet any rehab program available. And at the same time, I was looking for what would be the best way to work using my skills, using my interests in art, and be able to be productive as possible and reduce my getting any secondary infections. So that's some of my motivation. Now, if we fast forward and come to a time in my life when I worked for a period of time in South Africa. I had then worked in England, and I'd worked in America. And now I came to work in Israel. I brought with me a business plan towards starting my occupational therapy center. I came with a number of years of experience, and I was convinced that finding work would be easy, that being able to earn what I needed to be able to get stable and to start to progress towards developing the center, which was my desire to do, my dream from when I was a second-year student. I thought, I had my business plan, I had done a pilot trip. I thought naively that I would just persevere and work slowly and methodically according to my business plan and according to the pilot trip that I did. And with working in a facility, I would earn the basic money I needed and start to develop a private practice. And so with the private practice, I would get new clients. I would slowly add more equipment and more services, and my center would happen. Well, now comes reality. And it's been a little bit of a challenge for me to decide to what extent am I going to go online and share what transpired after coming to Israel. But for a number of reasons, I've decided that some of my story I am going to share because it answers some questions, and it also outlines some problems that I really believe need to be addressed. But I've discovered that I'm not the person in Israel to be finding the solutions, but solutions need to be found. Now, some of that has opened the doors to services that I'm now offering, which I'm offering online, and I invite you, if you wish to be in touch either for coaching or to look at my products or my journals and notebooks, which I'll get into in a minute, or my book, and there are other books in pipeline. So there's a number of things in the process that, as you can hear, it could be advantageous for me to share some of this information. So if you've seen one of my other videos that happened a few months ago, I mentioned that I'm starting, since I'm stopping working in person, I'm starting to transform my occupational therapy treatment room into a studio for doing my art. Now, in doing so, there are certain documents, certain papers, certain things that I have that I'm starting to shred and let go of, or to sell, or deciding what's the best thing to happen with it, to use as the basis for my journals and my workbooks. And having started to go through this material, I've discovered I found some salary strips from my first 2 placements of working, and the salary that I received could be some of the motivation as to what got me searching for other ways to work, not necessarily within a recognized facility. So let me give you some of the figures. I don't have the papers in front of me, but I can remember some of the numbers from memory. I do actually have the pages, so I'm not making it up, and I could show it to people in person. I'm not going to be putting it online because of confidentiality. My first month of working was I worked in a school in Israel, and I was working 6 days a week, full school days. So that was from 8 in the morning or 7:45 in the morning until 2:30 in the afternoon. And then there was a number of responsibilities, a number of meetings we had to go to after hours, paperwork we had to do after hours. So there was a lot of unpaid overtime that happened as well. Now, at the end of the month of doing all of that work, I received a wonderful gift, a whopping check of 390 shekels. So if we convert that, for those who don't understand what shekels is, that's roughly a little bit over $100. I forget exactly what the conversion was at the time, but it was around about $100 that I received at the time. I didn't come from America, so I wasn't actually working in dollars, but that was my first big problem. Now, if I was wanting to get stable in Israel, for anybody wanting to get stable in Israel, the cost of living in Israel does not allow you to be able to cover all of your bills on $100 for the month. So that caused my very first challenge. My next month of working, I received approximately 1,200 shekels, and then it went up to 1,900 shekels. So this is still way under what is livable. Now, to put it into perspective, my first rent that I was paying, I was sharing with somebody, and the first rent was $300 for the month. So if I was earning $100 and I had to pay just on rent $300, there already is a problem for anybody who can do the maths. My challenge came when I went to an OT supervisor that I met in a meeting that I went to, that I attended, and I said to her, how are we as occupational therapists supposed to be able to cover our expenses if our salary is so little? And she had no answer for that, but from speaking to a number of people, I discovered that it's an expectation that, certainly at the time, I'm out of touch of what things are like now because I no longer work with any of the facilities for a number of reasons. The answer that came back to me was that occupational therapists were expected to work for 4 months without a proper salary, and after the 4 months, you'd start to be earning correctly. Now, earning correctly still did not mean a very excellent income, not if you're wanting to earn enough to be able to establish a center, to be able to purchase your own home, to be able to have financial stability. How occupational therapists who are working full-time in the profession are managing, I don't know, it's a mystery. I would say, though, that along my journey to be able to figure out how I could be able to fulfill my dream of developing an OT center, I've met a number of therapists who have left the profession of occupational therapy. And one of the reasons very much has been because of the problems with earning correctly in Israel. So that's one reason. My next salary, if you want to say, well, that was just the first job, well, it didn't happen only in the first job. The next school that I worked in, my first salary was 490 shekels or 460 shekels. 460 shekels. After that, I got, I think, 900 and something shekels, and then it went to 1,000 something, and then slowly got to be a little bit more. So just to be able to cover basics, that income is not a livable wage, not for anybody. Now, let's say I went to the bank to see what kind of funding opportunities I could come up with. And yes, I did. I went to the bank and I explained to them what had happened, that I was wanting to work in my profession of occupational therapy. And I asked them, could I have an overdraft or could I have a loan or something to help me? And the answer was, no, they're not prepared to assist me. Either I need to get my boss to pay me correctly, or I need to find a different job, because paying such a low salary is actually illegal. So that is the reason as to why I've been hesitant to admit my reasons as to what motivated me to get into what my colleague or the student in OT says is non-traditional occupational therapy. Actually, the service that he picked up on is my freelance writing. So now let's go to another bus stop, another train stop, whatever stop you want to call it. And let's come into, now I'd gone to the bank and the bank wasn't able to help me. So I started to explore other avenues for being able to get the funding I needed, that I could be able to develop the center I needed, plus be able to sustain myself while I was waiting to earn correctly, although I was working a responsible profession and having to supervise students, although I was not yet being recognized as having a degree, and it was a problem. So now I went to an organization that that assists Olim, new immigrants, to be able to start a business and to develop a center, to start a business basically. They didn't know my idea of starting a center. And once I went into the first meeting and I explained to them what my goals and my dreams were, like this other business person, they started saying to me, but that's not occupational therapy, but you can't have individual and group, but you can't have individual plus products, but you can't have this and you can't have that. And before I knew it, they were trying to restructure what my profession was. So since some parents of a student had asked me to write a book to explain about occupational therapy already when I was in South Africa, and I did start to write that book. After having this experience with the company, the organization that helps people to get funding who didn't understand what occupational therapy was, I decided it's time to bring out my book. It took quite some time before I came to do that, and it took my assisting my mother to self-publish a teenage novel, which I'll put a link in the notes below, to that teenage novel. Well, that opened the door to self-publishing. Why was that necessary? Because a number of recognized publishing companies had refused the book that I'd written. And so eventually it came to a stage that I decided I needed to market myself. I needed to get more clients. Obviously, there was a lack of sufficient understanding about the profession of occupational therapy. Time to bring out my book. So that's how my book of Healing Your Life Through Activity came about. It was completely different when I wrote it in South Africa. It had a different title. I'm not sure whether I'll ever get to bring out the book that I originally wrote, but for now, I have my book out called Healing Your Life Through Activity. And so to answer the business person who asked me, how can I have three things up? Shouldn't I be focusing on one of them? Well, I needed the book, Healing Your Life Through Activity, in order to explain what occupational therapy is, so that I could get my clients and work with them, whether it was in group or whether it was individually. So now let's come back to another challenge. The challenge is I was building a center. Now, to offer occupational therapy, even if it's going to be a private practice, requires a number of pieces of equipment. And to help to understand this, since a lot of people don't seem to be able to understand why an occupational therapist needs equipment, let's borrow an idea from a different profession. And the profession I'm going to use is dentistry, because of the fact that most people go to a dentist sometime in their life. Now, if you go to a dentist, you will be able to see that a dentist needs to work in a dentistry room, in a practice. They have a secretary, they have a waiting room, and they have a room that you come into where you visit the dentist. You're going to go onto a special chair, not a regular chair. This chair is going to help to take you down from the waist, that you can be lying flat, or it bring you up. It's got a headrest. It's got various pieces to the chair. You're going to have a special light overhead. You're going to have all sorts of pieces of equipment that the dentist uses. He's going to be using a special angled mirror. He's going to be using something to a metal tool, I don't know what the name is, that's going to be prodding and having a look as to the condition of your teeth. He's going to be doing an x-ray machine. He might need a drill. He might need certain resins or whatever he uses to make a filling. He has pieces of equipment. Nobody can expect a dentist to do his job without his equipment and without the appropriate room. So let's keep that in mind and come back to my situation as an occupational therapist. I needed both the right venue plus the right equipment and assessment tools to be able to provide my occupational therapy services to the best of my ability, the way that I've been trained and according to all of the additional services that I'd come up with along my years of experience and my journey as an occupational therapist. In order to get the right venue, the funding for the right venue and the right equipment, I had hoped to either get funding through the bank or to go to this organization, but there was a block in the way, which is why I needed my book. Now, having started my book helped me to realize, oh, there are other opportunities using writing. So that comes to the freelance writing service. Now, in addition to bringing out my book, I also had started a blog to help to share some thoughts about occupational therapy. I hadn't done any reading online as to how to do a blog. There's some changes that needed to be made in order to improve traffic to my blog, but I'd got to start to do a blog. And so at a certain stage in one of the schools that I was working at, where I came across a certain challenge and I wanted to get the message out to parents of children who could be able to benefit from the experience that I had in this particular school, I turned to a certain website and I wanted to write an article. And my reasoning and my motivation behind that was because I'd written articles for magazines. Now I'd written an article for a blog, for my own blog, and I'd come across a number of websites that had articles, and so it seemed common sense to offer an article. I didn't expect to be paid for it, so that opened the door to my freelance writing. And then I decided if I could be offering freelance writing and get paid for it sufficiently, perhaps I could be able to earn what I need to be able to develop my OT center. Now comes in the challenges with COVID and with a number of other things going on, and my deciding that perhaps for now my focus would be, if that business person wants me to focus on one thing, my focus is on my online services as opposed to my services in person. So that's why I'm altering my OT center, my OT room to be an art studio come writing room where I can be able to develop the products that I'm developing, which you'll find on my online store, the journals and workbooks that I'm developing, and have those available, and they all complement any coaching that I do or any freelance writing that I do. It all works together in one unit because that's the nature of being an occupational therapist. So one more piece of the puzzle, and that is my current challenge as to what extent would I be continuing my OT hat or my artist hat, or could I merge the two? Now, a few years ago, I had thought of bringing out a workbook that required illustration. And that goes back to when I was in my first year of working and I'd been asked to illustrate and to write these handouts. Now I come along and I'm wanting to develop a workbook, and I needed to illustrate the workbook with, I have the skills to be able to do the illustrations, so that wasn't a problem. My problem came in with how do I get those hand drawings into the computer and format it in a way that's available as a workbook. So I did discover that it's possible to print workbooks via KDP and via certain other online platforms. I still had this barrier. I had tried scanning in the pictures, and although I could scan them in, there was a little bit of difficulty with how to be able to have them the quality that I needed to be able to get them into the format that I needed to have a polished, beautiful workbook with the ideas that I had in my mind. So that's where I came to start my Patreon, and I hope that through that I could be able to have the funds required to be able to get the Creative Suite from Adobe, and also to get myself a graphics tablet, which I need to be able to do my illustrations and to prepare my workbooks. About 2 months ago, perhaps 2-3 months ago, I forget how long it is now, I was interacting with somebody else here in Israel and discovered a course taking place of how to bring out 10 notebooks in 10 days. And although the training during that 10-day workshop did not cover everything I needed, it was the trigger that I needed to start to bring out my workbooks. It opened my eyes to a few other avenues of where to learn what I needed. And so for now, I'm working on a whole series of journals, of workbooks, of low content and medium content books. I do still have my other books that I'm working on. I have a novel that I'm working on and a few other books that I'm in the process of completing the writing and the editing of, and I hope to bring those out later. All of the workbooks and the journals that I'm doing, it's not as though it's any conflict to the work that I do with anybody individually, because all of them complement. It's a resource that my clients often need. And so instead of giving that as a PDF or an idea to a client of mine, whether I'm coaching them or whether I'm doing a video that goes out publicly, or whether I'm doing a group session, in any of those opportunities, instead of just giving that resource to a client individually, I'm making it available to other people to purchase as well. And that's another opportunity. It's part of developing passive income, and it's one of my ways to earn what I need to complete developing my online services. And as I continue and I progress, I'm hoping that my questions will be resolved as to whether I will continue online only or whether I will bring back the other services that I wanted to do in person and have my full center. So that's a question mark. But I hope that this video has been perhaps informative, perhaps entertaining. So I hope that that's answered all of the questions. I hope this isn't too long for you. If you have further questions, or if this is still bringing up question marks for you, put a comment in the comments below, and I'll be happy to look at whether I'm going to do a blog post to answer, whether I'll do another video, or I invite you to join my email newsletter. At the moment, I bring out an email just once in every few months because I myself don't enjoy being bombarded by emails from others, but slowly, I might increase that. I'm thinking of perhaps just an email once a month, not too much more than that, because it can be really overwhelming to have emails every day from the same person. So with that, I hope that I've answered your questions. I hope that you might enjoy the links below. You'll see a number of the services that I'm involved in. You're welcome to have a look at my online store. I suspect my online store might raise more questions, and so send in the questions and we'll see if we can do another video. And with that, I wish you a very blessed day, and I'll sign off here. Shoshanah Shear from Jerusalem, from beahappymom.com, and my online store, which, as I say, is creationsfromjerusalem.com.